Hi folks, we're Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the making and unmaking of the British industrial middle class. And I separate middle class as in a social class from the industrial middle class, given European, given the hangover from the aristocracy. The British view the middle class quite differently than, say, it's viewed in the United States or Australia, for example. So as far as the British commentators are concerned, it's the middle classes that are running Britain today. Now, from my perspective in Australia, those people aren't middle class. They're very well-connected, rich elite. But the British have a perspective of middle class. But if you're not an aristocrat and you're not someone that toils with your hands, then you're sort of in this broad diaspora of a middle class, and it's them that are running the show now, I think. So this idea that there's a middle class that are running Britain and they are controlled by the globalists. Now, if that is the case, then this middle class consists of something like 1% of the population. Now, they've got their flunky stooge foot soldiers to run around away with placards, but they're not the people making decisions or in control. They're just the stooges. In terms of, given the number of people are very wealthy, they live in the wealthiest areas, they have substantial real estate portfolios and so on, then they are an elite. They're not middle class, for goodness sakes. But the British say, well, you're not an aristocrat. You therefore, no matter how rich and influential you are, you must be middle class, given you're not an aristocrat. I see that quite differently, and in places where there's no aristocratic heritage or very limited. I mean, there's always class, but then it's middle class. In my perspective, is somebody who has some sort of skilled employment, maybe not high skilled, but it could be a factory worker, for example, but they've got permanent, ongoing, effectively lifetime or near to it employment, and they can afford to own property, buy a house and have a family, that sort of thing, and have dependents. That to me is middle class. Now, there's a range within the middle class. There's obviously the well-to-do end of the middle class, the not so well-to-do. Working class is, in my view, people who don't have continuous employment, whether it's through lack of skills or something else, and they don't have the capital to buy property or to support dependents, then that would be working class. Now, one of the great things about the aftermath of World War II was that many people that were once considered working class, the purchasing power of the paycheck and wide employment, that sort of thing, allowed people that were hitherto working class to become middle class. That is, they could own property and could have a family and support dependents. So the social architecture of the Western world changed a bit, even though there was still that, particularly in Europe, that those aristocratic barriers and so on. But I want to go back earlier than that to the time of the Industrial Revolution. Now, there are many things that were moving, and there were some tumultuous upheavals going on, the Napoleonic Wars, and all sorts of things, and then moving into the 1830s, which is when the Industrial Revolution became rather broad-based and kicked off, and then into the 1850s and so on. There were a number of transformations that radically altered Britain, and it's being that Britain was the cradle of the modern Industrial Revolution. I'll focus on Britain. Now, I'm going to use, just as a text here, that there's a number of texts, such as from commentators and writers such as Trevelyan and so on, but one that covers the period and covers the issues, certainly from my perspective, is a book. It's a Pelican book. England, it's out of print now, I would think. England in the 19th Century is the title. The author is David Thompson, and I think it was written first in 1949, 1950, and could be purchased in 19 50 something or other could be purchased for 40 cents, by the way. And that's the primary text I'll be referring to, although there are other texts. Now, I just want to look at I guess we're talking post-Napoleonic War, so the earlier days of the Industrial Revolution. Remember, it didn't start to move into a broad-based high gear thing until about 1830, give or take. So Britain needed a lot of technical workers quite quickly. The industry was spreading quite, railways and spinning jennies, steam-driven. Hitherto it had been wind-driven, as in windmills, or water-driven, like the water wheel, grinding grain and so on near rivers. So this was now steam-driven. Transport, the canal system for transport in Britain or England was nearing completion, or certainly was extending well along. New miles of railway track were being laid in the 1830s, and the steam engines were connecting places that would have taken days to get to previously could be travelled from point to point in 12 to 15 hours with the rail. So huge changes in infrastructure and transport, logistics, the markets and opportunities this opened up. For example, there were vast acreages that were uncultivated because you could grow stuff on it, but then you couldn't get your produce, your apples or your pears or grain or whatever it was. You couldn't get your vegetables to the marketplace because of the distances. They would spoil before you could get them there. But now with the rail, you could grow fresh flowers in Cornwall, and the next day they could be ready to be sold in the markets in London, for example. This created huge changes in structure in the economy and economies of scale that had been unimagined previously. But what it did do, it created created a huge need for technical workers, people that were technically capable of running machines, building machines, servicing machines, maintenance technicians, installation technicians, and so on. And this came on pretty quickly. Between 1830 and 1850, the amount of coal and iron ore and things like that had more than doubled in the consumption. So this was a big thing, and as I say, it came on quite quickly. Now, while this was going on, and even beforehand, there was a big displacement of people from the rural areas because there was a lot of, if you like, land that was considered common land. Peasants and so on could run their cattle or their sheep or whatever, their pigs, this sort of stuff on this common land. But then there came something called the Enclosure Acts, where this common land, if you like, was put to permanent profit motive, productive use by some of the bigger landowners and the aristocrats that owned large amounts of land. And wealth still came primarily from the land and agricultural production at the time. It was fast changing to industrial, but so when these lands were enclosed, this meant that a lot of the peasants that were living or able to live a marginal existence, among other efficiencies and so on, such as better tilling, better drainage, better crop management, better control of selective breeding of animals, these sorts of things. It was changing the strip plot system, where you'd have a little strip of land here and then one down the road and one up the back, and starting to more effectively and efficiently combine these things. Not that the strip farming didn't to some extent at least stay on. Even if you look in, say, 1950s Britain and the attempt by the government to promote local farming and production of agricultural products, there was still this idea of, or there was still this thing where there would be different plots of land all over the place that a farmer may have that were still his, but instead of combining it into one continuous farm, there was just bits and pieces all around the place, and that still went on. Not as much as the micro strips that had existed previously in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, but still. Distributed parcels of land around the place were still still the case in the 1950s and even into the 1960s, for goodness sakes. So, but coming back to the industrial, so there's a vast need for industrial workers, factories, railways, you name it. And how, because Britain didn't import any people, it didn't have a big population. It had at the time, 15 million, less than 15 million, I think, around at the time. And so this is not a vast population, but there's this huge explosion of industry and thus a demand for technically skilled workers. So what did they do? What was the, well, the issue is education and merit. Merit played a huge part in this. So entry from the working class, the labourer, if you will, the casual labourer, no less, from the working class into the middle class, and creating an industrial middle class, not a social middle class in the sense of people with who were from the aristocracy, although a small aristocracy, if you like, of factory owners did occur, and some of these people were given positions in the House of Lords as barons or earls or dukes and all that sort of stuff. That went on as well. But this industrial middle class was a special middle class that wasn't social. It was based on skills, not on a small elite did go on to become the social aristocrats. But merit was the key. You had to pass it. You had to be expert, and you had to be the best of the ones available. This was the if you like, the aristocrats put this filter in place that if you were the best and you passed your exams and you were expert at maintaining the industrial equipment and or even administration and operations type roles, accounting, a number of jobs and occupations came out of this more widely. But this became the passport to the middle class. Come first in the exam. Do well, work hard, study hard, but be efficient, be sober of habit, be sensible, and these sort of things. Be cooperative, and all this in the wider sphere. And this created an industrial middle class and was drawn from the working class. So the most motivated, the most capable, the brightest working class people, or hitherto would have been considered working class. Maybe they were from the land originally and came to the city as displaced small holding farmers. They were the source of the technical expertise that was to drive the Industrial Revolution onto its next stage. Many of these people became designers of new products, or to more efficiently deploy machine tools and so on. The machine tools, particularly kicking off from the 1850s onwards. And so the British, this is where the British industrial middle class came from. But it was a tightly controlled merit system, and this meant the aristocrats still had, to some extent at least, a quality control over who they would accept as being their immediate lieutenants in terms of the industrial work that needed to be done and the technical nature of that work. So this became the source, anyway, of this industrial middle class. Now, when Britain moved away from industry into services, which was a process that was already underway, really beginning in the 1970s. Any British lead in industry and so on had long evaporated, and attempts to revitalise it, which were well intentioned, largely were unsuccessful for the British motor industry, computer industry, and so on. All of these could have gone on to be big players on the international stage, but it was managed. They stuffed it up with aristocratic pretensions and government interference, politicization of bodies of oversight, and so on. So Britain moved from an industrial to a services, and once services becomes the primary driver, then merit ceases to be an issue, because what's a qualification for being in services? It's not technical expertise. If it's not technical, it can't be merit-based. It doesn't need to be merit-based. So the shift from the merit-based, strictly, tightly merit-based, you had to be good at what you did, you had to be effective, you had to produce, you had to be capable, you had to pass the exams, you had to, do well at high school and university or trades or whatever. But that requirement was suddenly removed, and so a new form of middle class, if you like, industrial, had moved to a services type middle class. And this was a completely different. Merit was not now a requirement, whereas ideological conformity and group conformity and so on was. And this is where, of course, we see Britain today. That proficient, pass exams, merit-based industrial middle class, that's now, or from the 1970s onwards, and more so as time went on, is not needed, or needed in much, much smaller numbers. And so, if you like, their seat at the table has been reduced, if not eradicated. Now, those who still believe in merit, still believe in capability, and still believe those things, they are now enemies of the ideological, service-based middle class, which means they have to be crushed and accused of being Hitler and so on. But that's the transformation that we've seen, and that we still see going on today, and it's accelerating in pace, I would argue, all across the Western world, and epitomised by the globalist control of the Western world, and that every Western nation now has lost its sovereignty to the globalists. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.